In today's episode, I'll talk about two interesting stories. In the first story of the day, I'll talk about the MSME sector of India and we'll understand why they have not been growing at a pace at which the Indian economy has been growing. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about how India is investigating cheap met coal imports that help steel makers but they threaten local producers. Welcome to the Daily Brief show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Wednesday, the 3rd of April. Let's begin with the first story of the day. There is a new report from ICRIER, which is a research organization in India that explores why so many of India's small businesses are not growing despite our country's overall economic progress being fairly strong. Now, these small businesses, like you may already know, are known as MSMEs or micro, small and medium enterprises. Now, most people might not realize it, but MSMEs are like the backbone of India's economy. They produce more than 16.5% of the total value of our economy and they employ well over 100 million people. They also serve as the underbush for larger enterprises because they supply the parts, services, and support that bigger companies often rely on. So in other words, if these MSMEs do not really do well, the rest of the Indian economy ends up becoming weaker. And right now in our country, these very businesses are struggling to grow beyond a very small size, and that is sort of limiting our entire country's economic potential. So therefore, in order to understand what's exactly happening here, let's first understand how small these firms truly are. See, many MSMEs are what are called micro enterprises, which basically means that they have fewer than 10 employees. In fact, data from government's Udyam registration portal shows that around 98% of registered firms are actually micro. There are even MSMEs that have no employees whatsoever beyond the owner, and they are often called own account workers. And this extreme smallness is even more pronounced in manufacturing, where only about 11% of businesses are formally registered. When businesses remain at such tiny scale, they often cannot really invest in better machinery or processes, which sort of lowers their overall productivity. Now, while worldwide, larger firms tend to be more productive than smaller ones, India's small businesses have an exceptionally large gap over here. Workers in big Indian companies can produce around 4 times as much value as those in smaller firms. In manufacturing, small firms manage only about 14% of the productivity of large firms. And that gap hurts not just these firms themselves, but the entire economy at large, because this means that we are not making the most of the talent and the energy that our workforce could potentially provide. So therefore, with all of this in place, the question is, why are so many Indian SMEs so small? Now, the ICRIER report that I mentioned in the beginning of the video digs into the many causes of this, and one big one here is the maze of regulations that surround this space. See, doing business means dealing with complex rules about labor, taxes, licenses, and inspections. Once a business grows beyond a certain point, for example, more than 100 workers, it starts to face a lot more paperwork and legal requirements like seeking government permission before letting people go or shutting down an entire unit. Now, that of course can scare owners into staying small on purpose because they don't really want to handle all that complexity or lose the ability to adjust quickly when demand changes. Now, in some industries, large businesses get around these rules by hiring many people on short-term contracts instead of making them full-time employees. One study shows that among firms with over 100 workers, about 38% of them are on contract itself. And this system, of course, makes life harder for workers because they don't really get stable jobs and protections that come with formal employment. This also means that many businesses see no real benefit in expanding and following every single regulation. Another reason MSMEs struggle is their limited access to finance itself. See, banks often ask for collateral or credit histories that these smaller companies simply do not have. Larger companies can show balance sheets, property documents, or lengthy borrowing records, but smaller family shops probably have none of those. And because of this exact thing, MSMEs often rely on informal loans from relatives or money lenders, which might only be enough to cover short-term needs, not the kind of investments that allows them to install things like new machinery or expand their workforce meaningfully. A study by the International Finance Corporation or the IFC found out that in 2012, Indian MSMEs had financing gaps of about $418 billion. This means this is the amount of money that they needed, but they were not getting. Now, that gap is likely even slightly bigger than that right now. And these money limitations means that smaller firms remain stuck at a certain level and never really graduate into larger and more efficient enterprises. There is also a knowledge and training gap in this entire space. Many MSMEs are run by families who rely on traditional or trial and error for their day-to-day decisions. Owners may not have had the opportunity to really learn modern management method that can increase their team's productivity or their company's productivity at large. In one experiment in Mumbai's textile sector, free consulting sessions taught factory owners and managers simple improvements such as better ways to track inventory and improve quality control. Now, the factories that adopted these very steps saw a 17% rise in productivity within just 1 year, and some even expanded their business. And those that did not participate in this stayed at the exact same level. And this shows that very often people just do not know what could make their businesses function smoothly, and they might also be way too busy handling day-to-day crises to invest time in bigger strategic changes. And on top of these problems, basic infrastructure is still a big challenge in many parts of our country. Businesses often pay extra for backup power to cope with unreliable electricity, as a basic example. Transport and logistic networks can also be fairly patchy, making it expensive or slow to ship goods and receive raw materials for these businesses. And of course, when it is too costly or too slow to reach customers across the country or in foreign markets, small businesses often get stuck serving only local buyers, which can sort of hinder their growth. And all of them can sort of trap them into a cycle of low revenue, which in turn makes it harder for them to spend on modern equipment or skilled staff. But despite all of these negative factors, the ICR-IER report also points to one area where MSMEs are finding new opportunities, which is e-commerce. See, COVID-19 pandemic forced many traditional businesses to move online so that they could keep selling during lockdowns. Now, for some firms, this shift has actually become a long-term engine of growth of sorts. The survey found out that about 32% of MSMEs they spoke with now get more than half of their sales from online platforms. Now, of course, not every company will find e-commerce helpful, especially if they make big industrial products or they only supply to larger factories. But for many consumer-facing businesses, using online marketplaces has been surprisingly fruitful. And when they do go online, MSMEs may have to upgrade their processes as well. They may need to train staff on handling digital orders and inventory, or invest in research and development in order to create products that appeal to online shoppers. Businesses that stay active on these platforms end up leaving what is called a digital footprint, which basically shows how many orders they fill and how quickly they do it, and also what kind of feedback that they get. Another small advantage that these MSMEs have been getting by selling online is that banks can now look at their data and see that they have steady sales, which makes them seem like safe borrowers. Some online marketplaces also guide sellers on things like packaging standards or certifications that are required for exporting, which helps them reach buyers outside India. But all of that said and done, e-commerce is not like a cure at all, because it does not directly solve huge problems like labor regulations or poor infrastructure, but it has definitely given certain MSMEs a very new path to scale up and also earn higher profits. With that, let's move on to the second story of the day. India has just announced an investigation into the prices at which some countries are selling something called low-ash metallurgical coke, which is often referred to as met coke. Now, the countries in question here are Australia, China, Colombia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia. The Indian government believes that these exporters might be dumping met coke over here in our country, which means selling it at prices that are lower than what it costs them to make it, or at prices that are lower than what they charge in their own countries. Now, if this suspicion turns out to be true and it is harming local Indian businesses, then India might actually end up imposing extra duties on met coke imports from these very nations. But before looking at why this is such a big deal, let's first understand what met coke exactly is. See, met coke is short for metallurgical coke, like I mentioned. You basically don't dig it out from the earth in the form that it is used. Instead, it is made by taking a specific kind of coal that is called cooking coal. Now, this cooking coal has moisture moisture, and various impurities that can spoil the steel production process if they are not removed. So manufacturers heat the coal to very high temperatures in ovens that do not let in oxygen. Now, heating without oxygen basically prevents it from burning, but it also drives out water, gases, and all unwanted elements. And what remains in the end is a hard carbon-rich substance that is porous, which is met coke. Now, this met coke becomes essential in steel plants that use blast furnaces, which is how most Indian steel is made. Met coke does three important things in a blast furnace. First, it acts as a fuel that creates extremely high temperatures in order to melt iron ore. Second, its carbon helps remove oxygen from the iron ore, producing molten iron. Third, it helps the furnace remain open or porous enough that gases can flow inside it. And by the way, if you are ever curious to watch how all of this works in action, there are multiple YouTube videos out there that show the complete transformation from coal to coke and then to steel, but essentially it's all about heating coal in an oxygen-free environment and then using the resulting product to melt and reduce iron ore. Now, with all of that context in place, let's come back to the specific controversy that I started with. See, over the last 4 years, India's imports of met coke have more than doubled. Now, this alone might not sound alarming to you at once because the demand for steel and its raw materials can go up as the economy grows. But the thing is, local coke manufacturers say that the real reason imports have gone up is that certain countries are selling met coke at unfairly low prices, effectively undercutting domestic producers. Now, this practice, referred to as dumping, is something countries are allowed to investigate under international trade rules. Now, India's probe here might take 6 to 9 months to show fruit, but if investigators find solid evidence that Indian companies are indeed being hurt by unfair imports, they can slap anti-dumping duties on sellers from these 6 countries. And by the way, just for your information, this is not the first step in this regard that the government has taken. In December 2024, they placed a quota on how much low ash met coke could be imported during the first half of the year 2025. And for your reference, the quota for January to June of 2025 was limited to 1.4 million tons, which is a cut from the 2.4 million tons that was allowed in the same time last year. And this restriction hit some importers particularly very hard. For example, Indonesian suppliers were limited to selling 33,000 tons every quarter, but India had imported more than 10 times as much from them in the same period just 1 year earlier. Basically, this quota was meant to make Indian steelmakers buy more coke from domestic producers rather than relying so heavily on cheaper foreign suppliers. And this new anti-dumping investigation is just one more move in this very direction. And this is exactly where the conflict arises because the steel industry is not welcoming these measures. Big steel makers like JSW Steel are pointing out that they actually prefer imported met coke. It can be cheaper, but even beyond the price, it often has lower moisture, better size, and higher strength, which are properties that help their blast furnaces run a lot more efficiently. Now, domestic coke, on the other hand, can be inconsistent in terms of quality and could sometimes lead to operational problems like choking the furnace. And the reason this is important is because in blast furnaces, a clog can reduce the flow of gases and it can disrupt the entire process. So for steelmakers, these very quotas and the possibility of extra duties on imports create uncertainty and potentially higher costs. And cost is extremely important in steelmaking because raw materials usually account for about 50 to 60% of the total expense of producing steel. And within that, coking coal and met coke can make up around 15 to 20%. If steelmakers have to buy met coke at higher prices, or if they are forced to use lower quality coke, they are risking hurting their profit margins. And that is why many steel companies have been upset about their quotas here. JSW Steel, which does not really produce some coke itself, still relies heavily on imports. And when the new quota was introduced, JSW tried to import a big shipment worth $90 million, but the court refused to let customs clear it because of the new rules. ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel, which is another major player here, imports almost all of its coke as well. Company executives have also warned that if the supplies remain restricted here, they might have to shut down some blast furnaces altogether. Now that, of course, would reduce India's overall steel output, which is a big concern for everybody because steel is such an important part of the country's infrastructure and industrial growth. But on the flip side to this, domestic coke producers say these government moves have provided some much needed relief to them. They insist that they have been operating at less than half their capacity because of the flood of cheap imported coke. And while imported coke can cost about $395 per ton, local production costs can reach up to $460 per ton. Domestic producers say that foreign rivals sell at prices that are so low that it is almost impossible to break even, let alone turn a profit here. And when India introduced these quotas, the immediate result was that domestic coke prices jumped. Some local coke production units that had been shut for running at minimal levels started up once again. But at the same time, steel makers were alarmed because higher coke costs can take a major bite out of their earnings, like we discussed earlier. So what we're seeing right now is a classic standoff of sorts in trade policy. One group, which is that of coke producers, wants protection from imports because they just cannot beat the cheap prices. But the other one, which is the steel maker, wants cheap, high-quality imports in order to stay globally competitive in steel production. The anti-dumping investigation that India has launched is sort of expected to reveal whether foreign players are really undercutting local producers unfairly or not. And if they are, duties could be imposed which could push import prices up and give local coke makers more space to survive and expand. If not, or if the effect on Indian industry is found to be minimal, then things might go back to normal for importers. In the meantime though, steel makers like JSW Steel and ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel are going to court to challenge the existing restrictions on imports because they are worried that their furnaces might be forced to use local coke of inconsistent quality or pay more for imported coke if the duties are imposed. That brings us to the end of the two stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, India's net GST collection for March 2025 stood at 1.76 lakh crore rupees, marking a 7.3% year-over-year increase, higher than February's 1.62 lakh crore rupee collection. Gross GST collections before refunds rose 9.9% year-over-year to 1.96 lakh crore rupees. But that said, total refunds surged 41.2% year-over-year to 19,000 crore rupees in March, driven largely by a 201.9% increase in import-related refunds. Second, food delivery platform Zomato has laid off around 600 customer support staff within just 1 year of hiring them under its Zomato Associate Accelerator Program or ZAAP. And this comes very shortly after the launch of Nugget, which is their AI-powered no-code customer support platform that now manages over 15 million customer interactions every single month across Zomato, Blinkit, and Hyperpure. Third and the final one for the day, Coal India Limited has announced a price hike of 10 rupees per ton on both coking and non-coking coal effective 16th April 2025. This increase applies to regulated and non-regulated sectors and will be directed towards the Coal Mines Pension Scheme or CMPS 1998. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this show. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.